Hello, I'm Peter Kenny. I've had several roles in financial services, in governance and management, risk compliance, anti-money laundering, lots of interesting spaces, and today I'm going to be talking to Mark about delegations of authority.
Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and as you just heard today, I have the pleasure of spending some time with Peter Kenny. How are you, Peter?
I'm excellent, Mark, thank you.
Cool, thank you very much for your time. Peter is a really intelligent man that I've known for well over a decade now, and anytime I work with him, I'm always in awe of his ability to see around corners. I think is a particular thing that I admire about you, Peter. So really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to be a bit like Lloyd, too kind, Mark, I think.
Well, as you say, the topic that we're going to talk about first up is delegations of authority. So I want to start with the question, given your background in governance supporting roles and governance roles and risk management, what are delegations of authority?
Yeah, it's kind of a good question, I think. So, look, people can get a bit hung up around this topic, and I see especially when you get down into lower levels of the organisation, you often hear people talking about, delegation, and I don't think they often really know what they're actually asking sometimes. Think of it as decision rights. Some people actually have a decision rights register. So it's, do you have the right to actually make a particular decision on a topic or in a particular scenario? So delegations of authority in simplest terms is, do you have the right to make that decision?
That's a really nice way of thinking about it. So it includes not just financial decisions but non-financial decisions, right?
Yeah, sure. So look, sometimes people even call their delegations of authority, because I have had this from people before, it's our financial delegations policy, but it's actually a bit more than that, right? So, there'll be even, say, the ability to make policies within the policy. Now, can everyone actually do that or not? It can be in other areas that's not actually specifically related to financial things at all.
So what sort of powers then are delegated?
Well, obviously the financial type stuff. And look, you usually see it broken down into particular areas. So you'll have finance and then there'll be HR things. So if you take the human resources decisions, can anybody just go and do a variation to a standard contract? Well, you would hope not, right? So as an example, there's one that's not a specific financial delegation, but is actually a non-financial delegation, for example.
And I guess you'd have things like hiring rights and firing rights and so forth.
And all sorts of things get captured inside those delegations.
Is there anything that cannot be delegated?
Well, there's some absolutely clear things that can't be delegated. The Companies Act, Section 30 and Schedule 2 rights, so they're things that directors have to have control over. They can't go and delegate those things away. And there's probably some things that you're probably best not delegating away. Probably the policy itself, for a start. Look, there's quite a few things there that you probably shouldn't want to delegate away.
Right, so the board itself would be responsible for or at least for approving the delegations policy, whether it's written by the senior management team and the CEO. It would be the role of the board to approve that. And as you say, there's certain rights in Section 30, you said, of the Companies Act, 130, that cannot be delegated, and everything else. Is there anything then that the director should be particularly wary about delegating?
Well, they should be probably wary about delegating things that don't make sense, right? So we'll take a financial one, which I have seen crop up before. Would you delegate away to your CEO ability to do unfettered CapEx spend that's not within budget, for example? Probably not. And a lot of things will have limits, right? So that's the other thing to consider, right? So there'll be some board restricted things. So the board will restrict particular policies, for example. Or dividend and things like that. But when it comes to where was I going with that one? So
what sorts of things that they should be wary about delegating?
Oh, wary of delegating. Yeah. So a lot of it is sort of common sense in that regard. So we'll take that one there. Yeah, you probably do want to provide some level of ability to not have to run back to the board for every single little thing. But at the same token, you might want to put some restrictions around that and say, okay, so we've got project overruns. Maybe you allow a certain level of that under the CapEx spend, something like that. So there's a lot of things that aren't specifically just pure numbers. And that's where the nuance comes in, I think, is with some of these policies, is that, and we may cover this off in a little bit in some of the future questions, just about how do you actually structure it, your actual delegations policy.
Yeah, I do want to get into that. I think what you've raised there is the tie-in with the budget, that the CEO and the management team will put together a budget for the year and get that approved by the board, and then generally a spend that's within budget they wouldn't need additional approval for, right? But you'd have anything that goes outside of budget, you've probably got some limits on, and outside of those limits you'd be going back to the board.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it depends how you structure your delegations policy as well. I mean, what we've been talking about there primarily is that, that top level board to, say, CEO. Doesn't have to be always CEO though for some of those. I mean, you can go direct to CFO for some things, so they're financial things, and could even be to others directly if you wanted to do that. It's, there's no sort of fixed rule about how to actually roll that out. Right. Commonly though, they'll be to the CEO. And then it's what you do from there. You have to have it down to the CEO so that it can then go further. Yeah,
the CEO delegates further down into the business.
And you can roll that all into one policy. So I think if you're all in, if you're one entity, you might want to say a smaller entity. You might go, actually, that's probably okay. Just roll with one policy.
Mm-hmm. Right. What processes are in place to assess and manage risks associated with delegations of authority? I'll give you a couple of particular questions. Things like financial transactions, contractual agreements, regulatory compliance.
Yeah, so what I would say to that is, it's your usual sort of toolkit things, right? So you're always going to have, sign-off processes, for example. If you're in that financial space, there's going to be the prerequisites for what you're expecting to see that actually might actually be even specified inside that actually delegations list. And if you wanted to pick something out of, say, the conduct and culture equivalent, there's lead and lag indicators. So what's your actual lead indicator from a compliance assurance perspective? Are you actually testing to make sure that actually those delegations have been done? And then of course there's the sort of obvious one, which is the system controls, right? So if you've got the delegations policy, has the financial system been set up so that actually it does channel it through and effectively controls it as part of the process itself?
Right. So a way of testing to make sure that everyone's following the policy of delegations once they've been made.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially the financial ones tend to be the slightly easier ones because you're going to have your finance system.
Yes.
You're going to have your setup for people that are in there, and anything that you're requesting to go through, say for a payment, Mark. So you're doing a payment or a request, it will go to your manager, and do they have the delegation that's already built into it, and does it exceed the level that's actually inside the policy,
which
and all those sorts of
one level up, and
and all those sorts of things. Yeah, so a lot of it can be system driven. Yeah.
Right. Now, that kind of alludes to the next question, actually. How does an organisation ensure accountability and oversight? Making sure that everyone's following those delegations.
Yeah, well, I think again, that's coming back to basically it's like compliance assurance or controls assessments, right? So, are you actually going through? Are you testing that system to actually say there's everything going through? What's your board actually receiving in relation to delegations of authority, actual compliance? Yeah. We'll take a really simple one. If there's the process for delegating to someone while you're away, is that actually being tracked? Is it actually being monitored? Do you have your risk team across it? And is it actually been reported to say it was actually all done correctly? Mm-hmm. And for those things that were then approved by that person, were they being actually done inside the system at the time and being checked?
I expect that those things like finances, where you have system controls, what would need to be reported up would be anything that is unusual, but anything that fits within the system, your control checks are in place. For things that are non-financial, then you might have a lot more reporting to the board on those things, right?
Yeah, and look, you can do other interesting things with the policy as well, such as, yes, we're happy with CEO doing something to a level. In fact, we're happy with them going above the level, but we actually want that to be explicitly reported at the next board meeting. Right. So there's another example of how you can have a little bit of flexibility and nuance inside these policy rules that aren't just literally a pure number.
Yeah, right. Okay. Coming back to the point you raised earlier, then, can you describe some options for structuring an organisation's framework?
Yeah. Well, I've seen a few of these. One that I don't have a lot of time for, to be frank, and you can sort of see the reasons for it, is the 65 column, 690 row matrix in a SharePoint system. Look, it just becomes really, really cumbersome. Keeping it updated is really hard. It's hard for people to actually go and figure out what they're actually dealing with and actually going in there and using it. look, it might be necessary when you're getting up to really, really large organisations. I think, realistically, is there that much that you can't handle, and dare I say it, inside a Word doc, and actually just flow it through there? And you can have layers of them as well. So, we were talking about that before, is that, that top level one can just be, here's our delegations of authority policy to the CEO.
Yes.
Then the CEO can have their own delegations policy for staff from there, right? So, and that can work quite well because, as long as there's good connections between them, because you really need those connections, okay? If you don't have the connection and then some people change and they're not quite as onto it, then suddenly does the person that's actually working on the CEO one realise that actually all their delegations are not just made up out of thin air, they're actually coming down from that board approved one to the CEO. So lots of good links in terms of references between those, numeric references that are easy to see where this one actually comes from.
I can certainly understand that a sequence of nesting Word documents would make a lot of sense, because then each level can look at the policy that's relevant to them, rather than everyone looking at, as you say, this massive SharePoint or spreadsheets that where you've got to find what's relevant to me, where do I fit in this? And
particular areas of the business, quite often don't have that much that they actually need to look at. So like, we're in the insurance space, right? The further you go down inside a claims team, the stuff they're looking for on a day-to-day basis is probably only claims related, maybe HR.
Yes.
Yeah. They're not going to be interested in some of the more exotic product things, or some of the other stuff that might be in there that you do need, but they're not going to be relevant to them.
So those nested documents are certainly, I think, a lot easier to understand. But as you say, the caveat is you have to make sure they remain aligned, they remain in sync.
Look, I think if you're in the risk space, it's not all about you. If it takes a little bit more maintenance for a few risk staff to get it right,
yes, and
everyone else in the business is actually benefiting from that, from having something easier to work with, then that's probably an overhead that's better than every person that ever goes to a Mongo document or a very large SharePoint list not being able to figure out where they are. Yeah.
And also, it doesn't seem that hard, right? If you have a delegations document that you're driven by, it's simply a matter of understanding that has a level above it and possibly a level below it. It needs to fit the chain. It's not hard.
Yeah. No, it's not.
Yeah. So how about the criteria for delegating specific responsibilities and the approval process for delegation requests?
Are you talking about changes being made to the policy?
Yeah, changes being made.
Yeah, look, it's not really that hard. You can make things more complicated than they need to be. Look, there's a couple of ways that you can actually handle this. One is, if it's a really significant issue, then obviously you need to raise it reasonably quickly, right? But there's actually a nice fallback for that, which I've seen elegantly done before, which I'll come to in a minute. But if you're saying what does the pure change process should be, well, find the thing that you actually need doing. Is it a tweak to something that's already there? If it is, work with the maintainer of the policy, usually someone in risk would be the usual thing. And go from there and do whatever request that actually needs to be done, or whatever change needs to be put up with the next update to the policy, right? Especially if it's something where it might be coming in the future. A reasonably elegant way that I've seen it done before, which is it requires a little bit of trust on the board behalf, is to say, well, actually, if we haven't explicitly board reserved this, then the CEO has the ability to actually approve it and maybe report it. So, you'd probably want to put some form of, common sense, explanation around what they can do with that. But usually it's not going to be something extreme, because the big extreme things have already been pulled off by the actual policy itself.
And then, of course, if there's any questions, the CEO will be able to pick up the phone and talk to the chair anyway and say, hey, look, there's something unusual's come up.
Yeah, and look, as I said, if it's a big thing, you need to do that. If it's relatively small things, put it on the update list. If it's a small thing that needs to be done right now, then maybe the fallback, open-ended, CEO has discretion, report through anything that's been approved that's, sort of incidental in the meantime.
How often should they be reviewed and updated?
There's not really a fixed time frame. There might be in some particular sectors, so I'd caveat that. But 2 or 3 years would be the normal time frame. 3 is probably a little bit on the outside. Maybe the less fast-moving entities would be there, and others probably want it a little bit more frequently.
Right. And of course, it can always be reviewed if an issue arises, as we've already discussed. Yeah. But otherwise, you do a general review every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. I think the bigger thing to me is, how well were they working? If they were set up and working really well, you probably don't need to do it so often.
No.
If it's something that, has been evolving over time,
That's when things can get out of sync.
or there's been major changes to the organisation, say, or something like that, then, it could age reasonably quickly.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you. General question now. What's the best governance advice you've received?
So I'm going to give you something that wasn't specifically governance advice, but I'll give you something that's probably a little bit of a laugh, right? A certain former general counsel who I work with did say to me on at least one occasion, considering what I'd said in that particular meeting with the regulator, the old cliche, flies are attracted more to honey than to vinegar. So I think that's probably quite true, and as you mature and you get a bit older, you probably are a little bit more reserved and apply a bit more discretion to some things, and probably works in the governance space as well, right? Don't wind people up the wrong way unless you really need to.
I think that's really good advice. The board that I was on internationally was one that I had a lot of frustration with, because being a sports organisation, a lot of sports people came to the top, didn't know anything about governance, and I ended up banging my head against the wall thinking, why can't I get this through? And the challenge of how you frame that stuff up to lead people to come the right way, rather than every time saying it's the wrong thing, we shouldn't be doing like this, why are we still doing it like this? So I think that's they're very wise words, Peter. Thank you.
And very passionate people in those sports organisations. So
cool. Okay, Peter, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, mate.
Really interesting conversation. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, it will be very soon.
See you next episode.
Okay.
Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favourite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe, and share the videos and podcasts.